So we know our data is set up properly, and what we'll want to do is just click in any single cell in the list. And then we're ready to begin creating our first pivot table. So for this, we're going to go under the Insert tab on our ribbon. And when we come in here, there are various places of where you can get your pivot table button. It really depends on the version that you have. So what we have is pivot table right here. In some of the older versions, there's a little drop down box here, and that's where you would find your pivot charts. We've got recommended pivot tables right here. In some versions, it was tossed over here somewhere. Then we also have the pivot chart choice. And notice for the pivot chart button, I can point at the top half or the bottom half. So if I want to create a chart, I'll click there. Otherwise, if I click here, I can do a pivot chart, or I could do the set where I get the pivot chart and the pivot table. That's just for the new version there. So we're going to start class with the recommended pivot table. So it could be here or maybe anywhere on this ribbon, but it's under the Insert tab for sure. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and push this button. I should also mention the Recommended Pivot Tables button came out in 2013. So if you have Excel 2013, 2016, any of the new versions, you're going to be fine. If you still have the old 2010, that button is not there. And that's okay, because we can still create pivot tables through the classic pivot table button, which we're going to spend some time in class doing too. All right, so here are some suggestions of pivot tables that Excel is giving us based on the data that we have here. So I'm looking right now at sum of sales by region, and that's showing me an example of what that would look like. So let me just scooch this over here. So if I look at my region, I do have 4 different regions here. And if I were to pick this one, I would have by row all of the different regions, and we'd be able to add all of the sales numbers per region. Okay, and then this right here is a small pivot table. I could come over here and use this option where I'm still using the regions, but this time I'm going to add the units together. Okay, here's one where I have information about the product, and then I have sales. So here's the 3 different products in this column, and then we're able to find all the sales numbers and add them all together. So that could be a choice that I pick, or maybe this one where I've got again the products, and then I've got the units. Here I've got it by salesperson, so I've got 7 different salespeople in this column here, and able to add all the sales together. Or I can add in the units, and you can kind of notice a pattern here. Really, with pivot tables, we're looking to usually do some kind of math. Maybe it is adding. So having columns of numbers is going to be helpful because you can add those together. If you don't have numbers in your list, that's fine. You can still use pivot tables. It's just you can do count only. That would be the only function that you could do. So you could count how many something happens. And then scrolling down here, there's another one where I'm able to put information in the rows as well as the columns at the top. So in my rows here, I've got it set by salesperson. And then in the columns, it's giving it to me by the different regions. And then you can see the intersection here of Benson and Atlantic. We can see how much in sales was actually sold. Okay, and that's just another example of what you could do. And then you could also do the same thing, salesperson by row. We could do the region by column, and then we have all of our units right after that. So those are a good variety of options. I'm just going to start with this first one so you can get an idea of how this works. I'm going to choose OK. And now my pivot table's been created. So a lot of things just happened on my screen. Number one, I started here on the sales tab. This is where my list data is. I might also call this my source data, okay, or my data source. There are a variety of words that you could use for that. And then when I created my pivot table, it added another worksheet tab, and I can see the pivot table that it created based off of that long list. So instead of 118 or so rows of information, I just have this small condensed summary table or pivot table created here. And I've got, excuse me, the regions, and then I've got the sum of sales currently set up. Another thing that happened on our screen is we have this field list that came up, and that's because I'm on a pivot table. You'll see in here I've got all of the different field names. These are the same exact field names in the same order that I have my list in. Okay, so that's why it's good to make sure that your information is unique in each column, and then just brief description of what is going to be in there, so it's easy for you to move things around when we get to that point. Now at the bottom here of our list of fields, it shows us 4 different boxes. These are our different layout choices of where we could go. And so you could go by row. Right now I've got regions in the rows. I have a spot to go by column. This one's currently empty. I have a spot here to put in values. So values would be any numbers. So either the sales column, because that had a dollar amount in there, or the units. And that's all we really had in our main list. So just coming back to the main list again, units or sales is usually what we'll end up putting in this value section. And then there's also a position here to add in some extra filters as well. So we have 4 different layout boxes that you can place these pivot tables in. All right, so let's practice this again. We're going to go back to sales. I'm going to start in any cell in my list, one single cell, and that's the important part, because if you have one single cell selected, then when Excel picks up your list, it'll pick it up based on the blank columns and rows around it. Now, if you accidentally highlighted a couple of cells, then Excel thinks your list is only 2 cells high. Okay, so just make sure you have one single cell selected when you're creating your pivot tables. So again, it's under Insert. We'll stick with Recommended Pivot Tables for a moment. And then let's try out another one. Let's do the sum of sales by product. I'm going to choose OK. All right, and then our pivot table has been created. So again, we started on the main list. The new tab got added. We get our pivot table example here. And then over here in our field list, we see the list of fields. We see the layout section. Another thing too that you'll notice with pivot tables is you get these 2 extra tabs up here specifically about pivot tables. So on your ribbon, you get these, and we'll talk about a few of the buttons that we see here and in here. Okay, now if you're off of the pivot table, you'll notice that those tabs disappear, and so does your field list. Okay, so just make sure that you're on the pivot table anytime you want to change anything about it, and then you'll have all the buttons here, all the buttons here, and you'll have your whole field list to work with. Okay, so let's look at this pivot table a little bit closer. This one's talking about products and sales. Okay, so product is by row and the sales is going to be by value. Now, if I look closer at the rows, I do actually have a second row. Okay, and then to see that, I'm just going to use the little plus button that was added next to bike here, and that expands it and shows it by date. So these are all the details about when the bikes were sold. Okay, and then here's skateboards. Okay, and close that up, and snowboards. Okay, so you've got these buttons here. If you notice any pluses or minuses, that just means that you have more than one row or even column too. So whereas when we looked at the first pivot table, we didn't have the pluses and minuses in here because we only have one row of information. Okay, and if you have 2 or more rows of information in the row layout section, then that's when you're going to get the little pluses and the minuses right there to work with. All right, let's try another one. Cursor's in a single cell, Insert, Recommended Pivot Tables, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom of the list and just grab that very last one. I'll choose OK. And again, we have a new pivot table. We have the field list that comes up, and then we have the extra tabs up here on our ribbon. And then down here is where the new worksheet tab was added. Okay, and just looking at this one closer, you can see I've got my main rows is going to be by salesperson, and I do notice the plus there, so I do know that I actually can open those up, and I should have a second level by date then, probably by the date that it was sold, and that's going to be in the row section, so salesperson and date. In the value section, we have units this time, and then anytime you put a number in here, it'll say sum of, because it's going to try to add, and we can change that function. We'll show you how to do that. Then we've got in here the columns, and the columns is referring to this section here. So by column, I've got each of the regions displayed there. And then so the intersection of any of this information, let me just collapse those up, We'll just go with Park and Atlantic. It looks like you sold 254 units. Okay, and then it's really nice summary table. So instead of looking at this long list of raw data, okay, look at how long this is. Instead of having that, it's really nice to be able to summarize and do something with that data. Okay, so like here, you can clearly see, you know, some of these blank spaces. Nothing's being sold by these people in these locations. You could clearly see numbers that are higher than the rest, and then numbers that are lower than the rest of them there. A couple low ones there. Okay, and it's just a nice way to take long lists of information and then summarize it. And we're able to summarize it through this pivot table. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is just go ahead and practice these skills. We're just, again, on the list, one single cell. We're just hanging out under Insert, Recommended Pivot Tables. And go ahead and try out a few of those and just notice what happens over here on your screen where you can see the field list. You can peek at the buttons, you know, feel free to point at them and get to know some of the names. There's the slicers and timelines we'll do in a little bit. Go ahead and look at those buttons. And, you know, play with the pluses and minuses and just get comfortable with what a pivot table looks like. So you work on that, and I'll see you back in a sec.